Well, it's shortly after 5 o'clock, so while people are just joining in, it's time to start. And I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. I'm Charles Melville. I'm currently president of BIPS. This is essentially a joint occasion between BIPS and University of Durham. Because this is in fact the Anne Lambton Memorial Lecture set up several years ago to honour the memory of Professor Lambton. And I'm very grateful to Paul Luft, who's essentially made the arrangements. It would, under normal circumstances, be Durham's turn, I think, to host the event this year, but for various reasons it was easier if we hosted it at BIPS. So it's a very great pleasure to me to spend an hour or so listening to our very distinguished guest and speaker today, Professor Saeed Amir Arjomand, who is a familiar name to anybody interested in medieval and early modern and indeed contemporary Iranian history, with numerous contributions of considerable significance and enduring value. And he's talking also about a topic that is extremely interesting and appropriate to the discussion about how Islamic Iran was, or how Iranian Islam was. And just to recap a very small amount of his CV, the first book I think that really hit the headlines was his work on the Shadow of God and the Hidden Imam, which I know caused a great stir for a new method, really, of using the social sciences in a more robust and interesting way to discuss historical phenomena. He's mainly known, apart from his subsequent books, for being the founder and editor of the Society for the Study of Persianate, Persianate Societies, and for editing the journal, which is still going strong. And these show his enduring commitment to the field. He's made a great influence, had a great influence, of course, on numerous discourses. So we'll look forward to his talk. It's being recorded. Anyone who's been unable to join will be able to watch it, a very likely edited version, also on our YouTube channel. And we'll have about 35, 45 minutes of talk, and then a chance for a Q&A. If you put your questions in the Q&A, I will feed them to Professor Arjomand. So without more ado, Saeed, over to you, and we look forward very much to your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, for your kind words. And it's a great honor for me to give the 21st Lambton lecture for this year, or 2021 lecture. Immediately after her monumental Landlords and Peasants in Persia, the late Professor Anne Lambton, whom I had the pleasure of knowing in the 1980s, pioneered the study of Persian political thought and made her fundamental contribution establishing justice as the principle of legitimacy of Persianate kingship. It therefore seems appropriate to devote this lecture to a critical assessment of the development in the study of what's currently called political thought. Let me get my share screen. Let me get my, there we go. I think if I have this, you can, all right. Is that correct? You can see the PowerPoint now, I think. So we can then have a critical assessment of the study of what's currently called political thought in the 6 or 7 decades since her pioneering work. And I don't believe Lambton used the term political thought, at least not in those pioneering works. which referred to the relevant texts as the mirrors for princes, in analogy to the medieval West, or the advice literature as it's often called, with reference to the Nasihat al-Muluk genre. She was, however, greatly influenced in her approach by her mentor, Sir Hamilton Gibb, who based his views on a very different set of tracts in Islamic law. Gibb consequently overemphasized the relevance of Islam to political thought, most visibly in his 1955 essay, where he deduced what he called the constitutional organization of Muslim societies from a set of juristic tracts written to shore up the Abbasid Caliphate against the Buyid and the Seljuk sultans who dominated Baghdad in the 11th century. Now, this, to my mind, explains the overemphasis on Islamic jurisprudence in Lambton's work, reflected in the replacement of Persian by Islamic in her last monograph, State and Government in Medieval Islam. Gibb's influence was much broader, so much so that I claim that he established the paradigm for the so-called Islamic thought, to which the last surprising subscriber was the late Professor Patricia Crone. Crone introduced an element of diversity into Islamic political theory, always conceived by her as God's rule, and she extended Gibb's privileged body of the so-called constitutional texts by adding sectarian doctrines of imamate, by imamis and the Zaydis. Now, she took these statements on the imamate as statements on theory of government, reaching the conclusion that, and I quote her, men who styled themselves amirs, kings, and sultans were illegitimate, devoid of legal status and moral significance. They were the rulers of the type that the Muslims had initially seen themselves as called upon to eliminate. And though they learned to live with them, they could never see them as intrinsically Islamic, end quote. The development of this paradigm for Islamic political thought, as you can see, I call it the Gibb-Lambton Crone paradigm, resulted in a completely distorted and ahistorical picture of the political ethic and public law of the Muslim world. The North American sociologist Dennis Rond coined the phrase the over-socialized conception of man in criticism of Durkheimian sociology. We may modify this phrase for our purpose as the over-Islamicized conception of the Muslim, to the exclusion of all other forms of collective identity. In truth, only a minute fraction of literate Muslim population of Iran ever read those abstruse tracts in Islamic jurisprudence as compared to other forms of ethical and political literature to be discussed presently. And therefore, it is unreasonable to suppose that all Muslims of Iran, not to say of the globe, derive their notion of legitimacy of monarchy and government from those texts. Now you can see why the over-Islamicized conception of the Muslim would make me, as the founder of the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies, which is mentioned, unhappy. The Iranian authors of political thought were not just predominantly Sunni before 1500 and Shiite after that date. They were also Persians or Persian-speaking Iranians. And when it comes to political thought, they actually express themselves quite voluminously in Persian. In fact, the revival of Persian as the literary language and the revival of ancient Iranian kingship went hand in hand. Furthermore, what I call Persianate Islam developed as a distinct variant of Islam under the impact of Sufi literature in Persian at roughly the same time as the revival of kingship. Ferdowsi and Khwaja Abdullah Ansari both died in the 11th century. The one was the master of epic poetry, the other of literary Persian prose. So just to clarify my title, the two terms, Persianate and Islamic, are not incompatible opposites. It's just a question of which term is more appropriate for describing political thought in medieval and early modern Iran. The Iranian idea of monarchy had already been introduced into the Islamic civilization by Ibn al-Muqaffa during the Abbasid Revolution in the 8th century. And it had been absorbed into the literature of the Caliphate, crafting it into what's been called monotheistic kingship. This literature, in turn, served as the source for the development of the Islamic political tradition broadly and much more narrowly within it of the juristic theories of the Caliphate, which legitimated monarchy as the Caliphate of Muhammad's successor, but it also accommodated the overwhelming reality of revived kingship by the sultans, that is, by the rulers of autonomous dynasties. This justification was de facto and awkward as sultanate or even as emirate by seizure, however, and despite such efforts, the tension between the legitimacy of the caliphate and the reality of the sultanate was considerable. Meanwhile, the rise of Muslim historiography produced a consistent reconciliation of Islam and kingship in the conception of the history of prophets and kings, Rusul wal Muluk. I've called this reconciliation a theory of the two powers. According to this theory, God sent the prophets to lead humankind to salvation and appointed kings to maintain order as a prerequisite for their subjects to follow divine guidance through the teaching of the prophets. We can find a succinct expression of this Muslim idea of the two powers in Persian in the Ghaznavid historian and bureaucrat Abu Fazl al-Bayhaqi. He says, and I quote, "Know that God Most High has given one power or that to the prophets and another power to the kings. And he has made it incumbent on the people of the earth to follow these two powers and thus to know God's straight path." End quote. A few decades later, Ghazali wrote Nasihat al-Muluk. He maintained close relations with the family of the dynasty of the great Seljuk Wazir Nizam al-Mulk Tusi. It was most probably a scribe working for the Nizam al-Mulk's family who forged the second part to Nasihat al-Muluk and added, which was added also, not only added, but also translated into Arabic as under a slightly different title. Now, this added second part opens with a famous restatement of the theory of the two powers, elevating kingship with divine charisma or farre izadi to the temporal match of prophecy. This forgery gained general acceptance and thus successfully adduced the authority of al-Ghazali as a great jurist and historian to the theory of the two powers. In the study of the Ansha literature, that is the decrees and the letters of the royal chanceries before the Mongol invasion, I found the secretaries in fact propagated the theory of the two powers, sometimes as brief mirrors for princes to high officials, but always invoked justice as the foundation of government. And furthermore, they were eager to establish these the principles of statecraft as their own normative tradition or sunnat. They didn't really succeed, but that's another matter. But to achieve this, nevertheless, this latter end, just like the jurists, they drew extensively on the Quran and to a lesser extent on the Hadith in their elaborations of maxims of royal government and justice. In this way, the fundamental Islamic sources, the Quran and the Hadith, were added to the traditions of kings and maxims of statecraft, and thus created a Persianate political ethic. It was probably to resolve the contradictions between the notion of caliphate and sultanate that Ghazali addressed Sultan Sanjar as the king of Islam, Malik-e-Islam, giving currency to the title in several variants, Padishah, Sultan, ya Shahanshah-e-Islam. All of which, this is the important point, all of which linked monarchy and Islam directly, bypassing the caliph, who's sitting there in that time. The idea was transmitted to northern India by the conquering slave generals who created the Delhi Sultanate. I think we're correct here. Who created the Delhi Sultanate. This new Islamic political regime was one in which the ruler was the Sultan or the King of Kings or Shahanshah of Islam, and was in principle elected by former slave generals. Now, the more important of these generals were also called King, Malik in this case. In Iran itself, Ghazan Khan adopted the title of King of Islam upon his conversion to Islam in 1295. This grafted the idea of the Persian idea of kingship upon yet another type of Islamic political regime, that is the Ilkhanid nomadic empire. Now, when I was assigned the chapter on political thought in the new Cambridge history of Islam, I added regime and political organization to the original chapter title to provide a context for the discussion of abstract notions of authority. What I've said so far applied to the unique regime of the late Abbasid Caliphate, comprising independent monarchies. And that regime gave rise to the Caliph Sultan or Caliph Shahanshah in Iran and India problem. The assumption of the title of King of Kings by Ghazan Khan brings us to an entirely different political regime, namely a Turco-Mongolian empire of conquest in which the Turkish military ruling elite, Askari, and the Persian Tajik subjects, Raiyat, were two rigidly separated estates or castes. It took the Ottoman genius to interpret the first term Askari, army men, metaphorically, and apply it to all servants of the dynasty, of the dynastic state, but it was taken very literally by the Ilkhanid and the successor nomadic empires, the Chupanids, Jalayirids, Timurids, Kargoyingo, and Akkoyingo. Now, Chengiz Khan's now let's turn to the Ilkhanids, the most important of these. Chengiz Khan's grandson, Ulegu, established an independent rule of the Ilkhanids, in fact, dynasty in Iran. You see the dates there. He and his son Abaqa employed Persian bureaucrats for building a centralized empire while promoting the idea of Iran. Persianate kingship had lost a serious conceptual rival with the destruction of the caliphate in 1258. Ulegu's reign witnessed what's been aptly described as a Persian Renaissance. And this Persian Renaissance was in no small measure attributable to the policy of the Ilkhanid viziers as protectors of the settled subjects and civic institutions. They sought to sell the idea of Iran to the Mongol Ilkhanids by means of what I call Persianate constitutional reading of Mongol rule in Iran. This constitutional reading began with considering Genghis Khan as the divinely elected world conqueror, but also at the paradoxical result of reviving the idea of Iran and assimilating the current Mongol rulers to its ancient kings. Already in Tarikh Jahangir Shah, just 2 years after the overthrow of the caliphate, Atamalek Jovaini offers a constitutional reading of the rise of Genghis Khan as the foundation of a new Persianate imperial monarchy. Rashid ad-Din Fazlullah, the great vizier of Ulegu's grandsons, Ghazan and Olja II, went further and sought to change the ruler of the Ilkhanid nomadic empire from a Turco-Mongolian Khan to a Persian king. The supra-tribal notion of king of Islam was therefore coupled with another integrative concept. To maintain the territorial integrity of the empire and to centralize power in its government, Rashid ad-Din subscribed to the emerging post-caliphal royal Islamic royalism and used its typical appellation of king of Islam for the ruler of what he called the realms of Iran, Mamalik Iran. The Ilkhans, literally meaning submissive Khans to the great Khan in China, were happy to see this non-territorial and subordinate Mongol idea, Mongol idea of the Ulus Ulegu, that is conquered subjects and lands of Ulegu, replaced by the territorial notion of the king of the land of Iran, Padshah Iran Zamin. Now, it's true that the Grand Vizier was able to go much further than the jurist Professor Azali and actually minted King of Islam on the coinage. However, Ghazan Khan seemed to have used the Padshah Islam on his coins for only 2 years after his conversion. In the last years of the century, he reverted to the invocation of in the Uyghur script, the following invocation, by the might of everlasting heaven, which represented the Mongolian idea of divine grant of empire by the sky king Tenri. Now, Rashid nevertheless proceeded with the elaboration of the constitutional reading of the Mongol Empire in Iran. The most important component of his political theology was original. He introduced the distinctive teleological twist, by making the Mongol conquest an instrument not only of restoration of Persianate royal justice, but also, and more importantly, of the spread of Islam. The historic occasion for the enthronement of Sultan Mahmud Ghazan as the king of Islam upon the throne of Khanate, these are his words, gave our great vizier the occasion to propound his Islamic cosmic teleology. He says the far-reaching divine wisdom required that the cure of the ailments for those people be Islam, that is, ailment presumably being the massacre and destruction of the cities. So as to make clear to the inhabitants of the earth the prevalence of God's eternal command. And his meaning was embodied in the generous presence of the King of Islam, the King of Kings of people, the shadow of God on earth, the helper of his religion, Sultan Mahmud Qaza. Then he quotes the Quran 3:26. This is God's bounty. He grants it to whom he wills. Now, the later Ilkhanids promoted a new political theology by producing these lavishly illustrated manuscripts that many of you must have seen of Shahnameh, and they also commissioned Alhamdulillah Mustafi to write their own supplementary epic of kings, Zafarnameh. Now, Alhamdulillah was offered a somewhat different constitutional interpretation of Mongol history. His stemmed from a teleology centered on Iran rather than Islam, and was embodied in his Epic of Kings, adding Genghis Khan and his descendants to the dynasties of ancient Persia and medieval Islamic empires. Faithfully to Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, he made the king's divine charisma transitive and spread to the realm of Iran, making it prosperous and luminous. Thus, the good news of Ghazan Khan's ascension came, he tells us, the good news came that to the land of Iran, Iran Zamin, a king shall be sent by God. Now, the Zafarnameh thus marked the culmination of Persianate acculturation of the Ilkhanids. Mustafi lived to see the disintegration of the empire in the late 1330s, however. But the two most important of his Persianate Turco-Mongolian political elements of his teleology survived with him. Dreams of Persianate imperial kingship and the reality of imperial Turco-Mongolian nomadic patrimonialism. The dream and the reality both survived, though their synthesis occasionally burst asunder. Now, I have mentioned the currently fashionable expression political theology once or twice to refer to the official ideology of an Islamic political regime, namely the Ilkhanid one. And this is very much a view from above, and we cannot assume that it was simply swallowed by the subjects of our Turco-Mongolian empires of conquest. So we need to examine the effectiveness of this official justification of its principles of legitimacy. Justice and kingship were broadly accepted as the principles or regulative ideas governing the organization of the political order. However, both legitimatory and contestatory interpretations of these principles are possible. We therefore need to turn to the pragmatics of royal symbolism for the purpose of contestation in the form of challenges to the nomadic Turco-Mongolian dominance from the settled Persian populations of the cities. Now, two mass movements in the cities, first in the greater Khorasan and then in the rest of Iran, developed in the first centuries of the Islamic era. And they both made extensive use of royal imagery and symbolism as they organized themselves into what I call informal urban underground kingdoms. if not in opposition, at any rate in disregard of the Seljuks and Ilkhanid courts in the royal camps. I will call the two movements Sufism and the Fotovat movement. They were located in the cities, the first Sufism in the convents, Khanaqah, under Sufi masters, Pir or Sheikh, and the second in the urban confraternities dominated by the Ayyaran, Javan Mardan, Fatah, Fotovat, etc., various terms used. In the beginning, Sufism grew hand in hand. I'm using Fotovat as a shorthand. Grew hand in hand with Fotovat urban confraternities of craftsmen and traders. They largely overlapped in the 9th and 10th centuries. And even though Sufi and Fotovat development paths diverged thereafter, they still remained interwoven and interacted for a very long time. From the earlier period of the overlap, earliest, we have numerous examples of the appropriation of royal symbolism and images by the Sufi Ayyar Javanmards when they were combined, overlapped large. The Fotovat confraternities tended to be thought of as I said, Persianate underground kingdoms of real or metaphorical princes, Shahzadeh, leader of the Sufi path, tariqat, and path of chivalry, Fotovat Javanmardi. The Buddhist inspired idea of world-renouncing prince suited the Fotovat confraternities' conception of the counter-king. Shah Shuja or Shah Kermani in the 9th century was a scion of a line of local kings. Abu Ishaq Qaramisani was, like Ibrahim Adham, among the princes and the grandees. These are quotations. And much later in the 13th century, Ohad-ed-Din Kermani was a descendant of local kings of Kerman region, who reportedly refused an offer of kingship in Erbil. Metaphorical counter-kings were just as many. The butcher of Amol was called the king of Fotovat and manliness, and Abu Ali Daqqaq, flour pounder, was called the Sultan Tariqat or Padishah Haqiqat. Last but not least, Abu Sa'id al-Khair was the Shahanshah Muhibban, the Malik al-Muluk Sufiyan. Attar calls him the sovereign of the path, Tariqat, and the king of truth, Tariqat. Now, turning now to the Fotovat challenges to the urban, Fotovat challenges to royal authority in urban confraternities, it was already afoot in the late 12th centuries under the Seljuks. Our rich source for the study of this phenomenon is the popular literature of the period in the form of narrated stories collected in bulky volumes. Two such volumes are named after famous Ayyars. One is Samak Ayyar and the other Lerana Habashi. I'll just talk say a couple of words about the more famous one, which is Samak Ayyar. Now, Samak's royal partner, Khurshid Shah, the Sun King, was a fictive prince that harkened back to the mythical past and could not be mistaken for any actual ruler in disguise. From his countenance shone forth the divine glory, Farre-Izadi and Farre-Padshahi, tourism of kingship, royal glory. In effect, however, the royal glory and the effulgence became manifest through the good fortune, at all of the king, but not directly, but rather through his servants, be they Pahlavans or paladins or brave Ayyars. And it was these servants who succeeded in their audacious deeds by these charismatic power, by fortune, by the fall of the king. Wonders are achieved in Khosrow Shah's name, Khurshid Shah's name, under his good fortune or iqbal, but by these pahlavans, and especially by the story's real hero, Samak Ayyar, who is assisted by his master, Shohal Pirzur, and other fellow Ayyars, such as Jangjuy Qassab, and so forth. Now, Khurshid Shah's name appears to have been taken from Visurami, the 11th century Persian translation of the Parthian romance, which is named in Samak itself, together with those names of some of the secondary heroes like Behruz and others. Now, the Ilkhanid period, this was the end of Seljuk period, 12th century, late 12th century. Now, the Ilkhanid period marks a weakening of the Fotovak confraternities in Iran that I claim is reflected in popular literature as well. The stories of the Ayyars had, in fact, marked the peak of their popularity as heroes of the Fotovak confraternities in pre-Mongol era. And they are now giving way under relentless Circum-Mongolian imperial domination to a somewhat different genre of popular literature. I refer to the massive transcriptions of stories by a certain Bighami, which are just beginning to be published, actually. And they amount to the mock epic of a forlorn Iranian kings as dreams of a bygone fairyland with no realistic expectation of their coming back to life. That expectation was to be fostered by the millenarian Shia once the Ilkhanid Empire collapsed. However, the major exception in Iran during the Ilkhanid era, all the way to Timur's interregnum, was the city of Shiraz, where the Sorghorid Atabeks had in fact submitted to the Mongols, and where the Inju and Muzaffarid local dynasties took over and remained outside of the ambit of Jalayrid nomadic empire. There, the material power of the Kuluz or Pahlavans as the Fotovak leaders, coupled hand in hand with the spiritual reign of the antinomian Sufi mysticism, combined to result in an exceptional democratization of political culture. Thus, the parable in Saadi's Golestan has a world-renouncing dervish boldly assert the following: know that the kings are for the protection of the subjects, right? Yet not the subjects for obedience to kings. The king Padshah is the guardian of the poor dervish, even if prosperity is through his charisma of God-given power, Farre Dawlat. The flock is not for the shepherd, but the shepherd is for its service. And Hafez, a century later, در میکده رندان قلندر باشند که ستانند و دهند افسر شاهنشاهی. At the door of the tavern are found the wrens of the qalandar who take and give the crown of imperial kingship. Now, the development path of Sufism in the era of Turco-Mongolian domination diverged sharply from that of Fotovak. As Sufism extended, the Sufis extended their convents to the countryside, and they succeeded in massive conversion of rural population of the Turco-Mongolian empires. I follow the late Abdullah Hussein Zarrinkoub in quoting 14th and 15th centuries, the age of Sufi saints or friends of God, or Ya Allah. By the early decades of the 15th century, the sovereignty of the Sufi masters was not merely metaphorical, but clearly implied aspiration to temporal rule. This is quite evident with Shah Ne'matullah Wali, he's called Wali, friend of God, who founded his order and died in 1431, but equally with the descendants of Sheikh Safiuddin Ardabil. Let me say just a couple of words about each of them. Between around 1370, when Amir Timur was actually a local ruler in Samarkand, he met a Sufi hermit named Ne'matullah, who was fairly young then. But the fame of the Sufi hermit expanded. He heard that he's taking bay'at, oath of allegiance, by the local Turco-Mongolian tribesmen, and he was alarmed. So Timur evicted the saint with the remark that, and I quote, "The two kings do not fit within a single country. Let him go to another kingdom." And the saint departed and reportedly sent back the message, and I quote, "My kingdom is a limitless world, whereas yours only extends from China to Shiraz." Well, it hadn't then, but it will later. Now, Shah Ne'matullah subscribed to, and in turn promoted the then current idea of sainthood or velayat, maintaining that the sealing of prophecy did not end divine contact with humankind. There would be an uninterrupted bila enqita series of saints whose ranks were those of the poles or axis mundi, Qutb, and Wali, friend of God, like himself. Now, Shah Ne'matullah assumed that true sovereignty belonged to him and could be inherited by his descendants. He called his son Shah Khalilullah, he called him my sovereign shadow, clearly alluding to the so-called prophetic hadith, the Sultan is shadow of God, the shadow of God on earth. The case of early Safavids is not quite as clear, but nevertheless is beyond doubt. Safiuddin's grandson, Khaja Ali, who died in 1427, was also called Sultan Ali, and he brought back from his pilgrimage to Mecca what he claimed to be the banner of the messenger of God, and erected it in the convent in Ardabil. Furthermore, he named his son Sultan Ibrahim, and the latter became known more revealingly as the Sheikh Shah. The appropriation of royal titles, Sultan and Shah, into their proper names by the Safavids and the Ne'matullahi Sheikhs in the 15th century, this pushed the appropriation of royal symbolism into a significantly higher level of contestation. As Sufi saints counterclaims thus became more open and evident, their metaphorical sovereignty came closer to realization. The Safavid Shah Ismail's Mahdist revolution in around 1500 introduced a radical change in the conception of kingship. This was facilitated by the fact that popular Sufism had become increasingly tinged with the Shiite expectation of the advent of the Mahdi, which infused a further sacral element into the idea of temporal rule. According to the historian Amir, Ismail's father and grandfather sought the unification, here we go, unification of dervishhood and kingship. جمع درویشی و شاهی. Now this is, I think, a very significant phrase. Khan Amir, in fact, left Herat for India in the last years of his life, bringing the fruit of the latest symbiosis of Sufism and kingship to the Timurid conqueror of India, Babur, but he delivered it to the latter's son, Humayun. What has recently been called millennial sovereignty was thus transplanted to Mughal India and spread throughout the Persianate ecumeny. In the Ottoman Empire as well, but that's another story. This early 16th century sacralization of worldly kingship as millennial sovereignty was a highly paradoxical end result of the transformation of Sufism over the centuries that in fact had begun with the assertion of the nullity of earthly power in the Sufi idea of world renunciation, Terk-i Dunya, which was typical of all these Sufi princes from Ibrahim Atam and the follow model of Buddha onward. Now, allow me then to end with this bold and paradoxical assertion, as our time is up, and refer you for its proper proof to my forthcoming book. For now, I thank you for your patience and will not tax it any further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saeed. That was a very interesting tour of the fascinating period, of course, of Iranian history and the intersection between Sufism and kingship, which is something I think everyone interested in the period has grappled with to some extent. It's significant, of course, that Ghazan and the others had to acknowledge Islam as a major force, and they took it upon themselves to make sure they had some counselors and so on. But is it your impression that they were not really personally very bothered about following Islamic doctrines themselves? And in fact, it's more like secular law, even through into the Safavid period, that was prevailing rather than Islamic jurisprudence as a sort of defining method of government, if you like.
Yes. Yes, I think that was certainly the case. The people who were pushing Islam were, as I said, people like Jovainis or Rashiduddin Fazlullah and the bureaucrats and other viziers who are very important in this period in promoting the idea of Islam, Iran Zamin, and so forth. And together with it, of course, the notion of kingship, which I think means temporal rule, because of course, pre-Islamic situation was changed by the coming of Islam, and it said that it couldn't be sacral kingship anymore, so it becomes sacred, secular kingship. And that was very much the case, and Timur was very devout, and he was scared that he would tremble each time he went to see a Sufi master. So what he accepted was not really the Sharia of the Sufi, but the miraculous powers of the Sufis, and you see that very much in the history of the 15th century. They just take them to battlefield and they have to produce miracles. So that's very different from Sharia. And Shah Rukh, of course, makes this Timur's son this attempt. It produced a very interesting manual, still unpublished, by his Shaykh al-Islam, who took him seriously in the early 15th century. But that was far from being the case, and it really had very little impact. And either that or this, if you like, the social or caste character of the Timurid regime continued to the very end, and the Tajiks and the Turks couldn't intermarry and so forth. So and so within that context, yes, certainly there was. And when Islam is introduced by Shah Ismail, etc., at first it's really in the Mahdi's form of Shiism, which is at that point very familiar to people because of the Sufi idea of velayat, and rather than either other forms of Shiite doctrine. But it certainly is millenarian and so forth. So it does produce this notion, if you like, that you could call it millennial kingship, but I think it's a Sufi, it's a combination of spiritual and temporal power, and indeed this is what Amir says also in Jam-e Darvishi Shahi means the integration of spiritual and temporal power. Suri wa Ma'navi, Saltanat Suri wa Ma'navi, that's already in the Yazdi, in the Timurid period.
Yes. Well, we have a couple of questions already, and one appreciation from Parvane Pourshariati. Hi, Parvane. Alexander Shepherd says, thank you very much, Dr. Arjomand. Could you discuss the influence of these medieval theories of Persian kingship on Khomeini's political philosophy? Even though he was anti-monarchist, do you believe there is an intellectual connection? Did Khomeini also seek a unification of dervishhood and kingship?
Well, there is a connection. The connection is, of course, in the term velayat and velayat faqih. That Khomeini seeks actually to, the connection is as follows, that he really detaches it from Sufism and claims it for the jurists, fuqaha, as upholders of the Sharia. So the notion of velayat is changed completely, but what is very similar is that the Safavids were called the Khandan velayat, the dynasty of velayat. And of course, Khomeini was the founder of velayat faqih, or of the jurists, mandate of the jurists. So the connection is in that very term. That makes it similar, of course, the ruler, and it sacralizes, of course, the position of the leader of the Islamic Republic. But then the Sufi connection is not there anymore. It's appropriation, if you like, of the Sufi ideas by the jurists. If I was, for the earlier period, I was talking about appropriation of royal symbolism by the Sufis. Now they're disappropriated in turn by the jurists, by the Shia jurists and Khomeini.
I think rather specifically, the Imams really take over from the Sufis, don't they? I mean, all the popular veneration of the Imams, which in previous periods was really the popular veneration of Sufi masters. They seem to have sort of switched the personalities, but the role was the same, essentially.
Absolutely. I give you an example. I've been living in the city of Kashan for the past year, on and off. Nice. And of course, every former Sufi shrine is now an Imamzadeh.
Imamzadeh, yeah.
and very much so, yes. And so Imamzadeh are really the appropriators not only of the symbols, but actually the actual shrines building of these former Sufis in Iran.
We have a question from Milad Udabai also. Thank you very much. 2 questions. I'm wondering if you can make explicit the relationship between the Persianate and Iran in your lecture. Does the conceptualization of Persianate political thought assume the political and territorial space of Iran, or Iran Zamin? And secondly, well, if I just read the second one, they're in the chat, if you, in the question and answer side, if you want to see for yourself. Given your attempt to move away from over-Islamicized conception of political thought, I'm struck by use of political theology. Does political theology here refer exclusively to divine kingship as opposed to the Islamic caliphate or political thought of Latin Christendom?
Okay, two questions. One, what's the relation between Iran and Persianate? Well, I think the Iran Zamin becomes critically important in this transition in the Ilkhanid period. The Islam, the idea of king of Islam is appropriated for the rulers, and they're persuaded it's better to be independent, to have a territorial notion of state. Of course, many of the Mongol ideas of patrimonials remain prevalent, but then this really doesn't remain, the political theology of this period doesn't remain confined to Iran or the Ilkhanid Empire. It already was there before the Ilkhanids came. The idea of Persianate kingship was created, was used, and was the official ideology of the Delhi Sultanates, the sultans of Delhi in the 13th century and 14th century. There, it's certainly not Iranian, but Persianate, but the idea of Shahanshah is there, the idea of Malik is there, which not so much Shah for it's interesting how that was reserved for just the Shahanshah. So the idea really spreads throughout the Persianate world. The Ottoman Empire, that's a long story and debated but I didn't have time for that. But certainly there was kind of this, I would argue here and elsewhere that the Suleiman, as Fleischer shows, in fact, switched, couldn't choose between millennial kingship of Shah Ismail and the opposite, and of course, but Salim and Suleiman chose to oppose. So the reaction very much was the Ottoman Empire's exposition of the Sharia and Suleiman Qanuni was a reaction to Shah Ismail, but it took for a while for Suleiman to give up this idea of divine kingship, of Persian kingship, and of course they didn't give it up entirely. They were always called Padishah, or the imperial king, to the end. So it's the Iran is not, and of course Iran is important in Ferdowsi. Iran is important in these people, in Hamdullah Mustafi, in the Ilkhanid period, but the idea of kingship, certainly what I call Persianate kingship, really is freely transportable to other parts of the Muslim world, of the Persianate world. And let's remember that, of course, the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century was as Persianate as India in terms of its official culture, ruling dynasty and culture of the court and so forth. Now, the second question, well, I'm not, that's political theater exclusively to divine. No, the political theology, I started using it in terms of these Mongols because it was a startling development. It's not obvious that that Genghis Khan was sent to promote to spread Islam in the world, and it's a very ingenious idea. So I kind of use the term for them there, but certainly you could talk about a political theology the way at least I see it, and it's not an essential concept I could have used. I sometimes switch to teleology in terms of the goal of history as implied by this reading. You could certainly call caliphate a sultanate regime, political theology as well. Yeah, I hope this answers the question. I just said I used it because it's a catchy phrase. I could easily use another term, but it applies. It's a general term. It would apply to millennial sovereignty. It would apply to the King of Islam, and it would apply to sultanate, caliphate regime.
So we probably need to speed up our questions and answers, but just briefly, Amir Nayabpour asks whether you differentiate political thought from political philosophy, and
yeah,
well, you can see the questions there.
Yeah, no, neither is of course a term that you can find in Persian literature of the period. It's not. I mean, it's our theorizing. We could do either. Political philosophy is a little more precise, so that's why I haven't used it, because of the Greek influence, and of course the political science, the Greek political science very much produced Islamic philosophy with Farabi and others. So the political thought, in fact, is more general, and to me, it could be used without being any misleading implications about the Nasihat al-Muluk genre or about mirrors for princes and so forth. Whereas political philosophy would be much more precisely theories that I really haven't talked about much here, but I could elsewhere, and so I would not include that. The second one, do you think that you mentioned conception of yeah, well, this is the whole thing. Of course, political philosophy is supposed, is not really Aristotelian. The notion of the common good is not there. The notion using imam as opposed to for the statement, etc., is a complete, it changes the meaning of Aristotle. So much of the Greek political philosophy actually get lost and gets interpreted in a way that makes it a lot less significant. So that's why I didn't include political philosophy, but I do elsewhere. Did the doctrine of seal of prophecy pose a... No, there wasn't any discussion of the seal of prophecy whatsoever. It's the opposite, that the seal of prophecy doesn't really happen. And Matullah Ali and others said that the velayat, seal of prophecy, is followed immediately by the beginning, the end of the cycle of prophecy, by the cycle of velayat, in which the saints, the friends of God, continue, and I use the term bela and reta, all the way down to the present and into the future. So seal of prophecy is really not an important.
It's a slightly Ismaili idea anyway, isn't it, of the cycles of history, and the age of prophecy is over and then we're into the next one. As far as I remember, it's one of the key features of some of the Ismaili thinking.
Yes, and of course in this period, the Ismailis become a Sufi order, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just briefly.
What about this? Have I answered all of them, or no?
There's one interesting anonymous question about the marriage of monarchy and religion throughout Iranian history. Did it develop?
No. Yeah, there was
the Iranian. Of course, it's always been there, as you say. Monarchy and religion have always been going along. It's a case of, in a sense, how close they are at different periods and whether the influence swings from one to the other. I mean, you've only got to look at medieval European history to see mixture of conflicts and coming together all the way through. Well, I think we're quite way past 6 o'clock. I'm not sure quite what the time is.
There, good.
Yeah, there we go. I'd like to just draw it to a close. We've got well, could you give us some information about your forthcoming book?
Yes. Well, there are actually 3 of them. One, I think that is includes Ismailis, etc. is called is Messianism and socio-political revolution in medieval Islam, something like that. And the University of California Press is publishing that. The other ones are under review. One is Sufi world renunciation and the legitimacy of kingship, which very much discusses these ideas that I mentioned. I got to at the end, from the age of Velayat onward. And the third is actually the 3rd volume, a trio on revolutions, and it's Apocalypse and Socio-Political Revolution in the Persianate World, which again covers the topic of the last part of the discussion. So I think the first one should be out by the end of this year, with a bit of luck, but these things you only believe when you see it, actually.
Thank you very much, Saeed. We have a couple more sort of late arrival questions, but perhaps they could address themselves to you personally, I guess, 2 anonymous attendees. I think we should draw to a close if you don't mind. I should mention, incidentally, Saeed is sitting in Italy at the moment, which is very nice for him, but unfortunate that we couldn't have this lecture in person this year, but we're all obviously hoping that this will be possible again soon. So thank you very much. This was, especially for me, and I'm sure many others, a very interesting rehearsal of these very important issues that
thank you.
All through the period you were talking about. A fascinating insight into your views on them. Thank you very much. So without more ado, I'll thank everybody again and hope to see you next time. Thank you, Saeed.